ATI's budget offering, the Radeon 9550, is a very impressive card. For less than $60 in mid-2004, you could buy a card that could play a lot of current generation games at higher frame rates than Nvidia are offering at the same price point, most notably the Geforce FX5500. Not only did it perform way beyond the card from its price range, it could even be overclocked very easily, granting a ton of extra performance for completely free. So today let's take a look at this budget card with a test system much faster than anything of the era, and see how ahead of Nvidia's FX5500 it actually was.
It had been a massacre.
Here's the two cards we'll be comparing. The Radeon 9550 from Gigabyte, and the Geforce FX5500 from MSI. They both have 256MB of DDR video memory clocked at 196 MHz, so 390 effective, and use a 128-bit memory bus. That's an important detail. Some FX5500s and most 5200s have 64-bit buses, and it really does affect performance from my testing. The Geforce runs at 270 MHz and the Radeon at 250. They both have 4 fragment pipelines, 4 texture units, and again 4 raster units. The FX5500 is built on a 150nm process, the 9550 is built on 130nm. The Radeon has 75 million transistors, the Geforce has 47 million. On paper outside of the transistor count, the cards are very similar. Also, for the sake of my sanity, from now on I'll be calling the ATI Radeon 9550 the R9550, and the Nvidia Geforce FX5500 the FX5500s, unless otherwise stated. Most of the FX5500s I've encountered have active cooling, though most R9550s don't. That's more than fine, the R9550 doesn't get hot enough to really need it. I personally don't care about silencing all the tech, some people do, but if I can overcool something then I probably will. The reason I mention this as well, overclocking. The R9550 uses the RB350 core. I cut down the R350 with half the fragment, texture and raster units. The thing is, other cards built on the RB350 core like the Radeon 9600 and 9600 Pro simply ran at faster clock speeds, or had higher clock memory. The R9550 ran at 250MHz core with a 200MHz memory. The R9600 ran at 325MHz core with the same 200MHz memory, and the Radeon 9600 Pro is even faster at 400MHz core and 300MHz memory. All Radeon 9550s can be flashed into an Radeon 9600. It's the exact same card sold at a different clock speed and completely different price points. The only reason why you'd want to do this is that flashing it stops the ATI drivers from dialing back the overclocks. Most R9550s can run the core at the speed of the 9600 Pro at 400MHz and even higher. But the memory is usually never going to go above 200MHz, and I'd suggest against even trying to. It did kill one of my cards I'd tested memory overclocking on. Also, if you have the Gigabyte variant of the card and are trying to flash it with no luck, use the SSD option when trying to flash. I spent way too long trying to flash it in the same way as my other card, the Sapphire variant, even going as far as having to use another computer and a PCI video card. I'll put more info in the description, it's kinda complicated, but I had to go through all forum posts to really figure this out, and it worked for me in the end. In conclusion, the Radeon 9550 is an amazing overclocking card. I got mine beyond 400MHz 9600 Pro speeds all the way to 466MHz. From 250 to 466MHz. Even if yours can only clock at 400MHz, that's an insanely good level of overclocking that doesn't require a volt mod, or risking lifespan of the thing. Well, that's if you have active cooling or an aftermarket cooler. I've used both a VGA silencer and the generic cooler from China, and they do more than a good enough job. The FX5500 though? Yeah, no. The FX5500 at stock runs at 270MHz, and I was barely able to get mine to 300MHz before it started to artifact. Sure, people on hardware bot have gotten those to much higher clocks than that, but that's with water cooling, volt mods, and just for the duration of a benchmark run. The Radeon is 100% rock solid stable at that OC speed. Even 300MHz at the Geforce wasn't stable for more than a short period of time. So for the test today I'll be using drivers from 2008. Not really intentionally, but after a few hours of preliminary testing, I found both these drivers perform the best for each card. Catalyst 8.12 is used for the Radeon, and Release 175.19 for the Geforce. I'll also be using a test system much faster than a Pentium 4 or Athlon, which would have been more period correct, but the focus today is on the graphics cards themselves. This system, which is yet to be named, is almost as fast as any AGP based rig can ever be. featuring an ASRock 4-core dual SATA 2 motherboard, an LGA 775 board based on the VIA PT880 chipset, capable of running both PCI and AGP video cards alongside either DDR or DDR2 memory, and most importantly a fast processor. Anything from a Prescott based Pentium 4 to a Quad-2 quad will run in this motherboard. Though I actually have a Xeon in this board, an X3220. Don't let the Xeon name fool you though. This isn't an LGA 771 Xeon modded to work on the board, it's actually just a native LGA 775 Xeon rebrand of the Q6600. Regardless, it's more than overkill for these tests, and I've actually played modern games on the system when running my HD3850 AGP. GTA 5 is actually kind of playable under Windows 7, but it ran out of memory pretty quickly and became a slugfest before BSODing. Well, it's kind of cool seeing GTA 5 running on an AGP video card, even for just a short period of time. So, to put simply, the system is as follows: a Xeon X3220 at 2.4 GHz, 4 GB of DDR2 533MHz memory, with Windows XP Service Pack 3 running from a SATA 2 hard drive, a 160GB drive that's kinda failing, and a 500GB hard drive used for games. I might throw an SSD in here in the future once I upgrade my main system, though it already is pretty fast and snappy as it is. So to start the benchmarks, we have the legally required 3D mark tests. Right away, the difference in scores isn't minor. The R9550 scored 9,958 points, and the FX5500 6,776 points. These scores were from the second run of the benchmarks, as usually the second run is lower and can be repeated with very similar results. 3D Mark 2003 was pretty harsh on both cards, but the FX5500 was hit much harder. 2,499 points for the R9550, and 1,536 points for the FX5500. Aquamark 3 has 3 scores: CPU, graphics and overall. After 2 runs for each card, the CPU score is practically identical, and the difference in the graphics score is very major between the two. From 1,998 for the Radeon 9550 to 987 for the FX5500. It's pretty obvious which card to run this round. Just look at how slow the FX5500 is compared to the Radeon 9550. The footage you're seeing is frame perfect synced from the start, and yet look at how behind the Nvidia card is. Overall, the R9550 scored 18,617 points and the FX5500 9,537. Wait a second, I thought it just added up the CPU and graphics score to get the overall score. I guess not, I ran the tests 3 times and got practically the same score for the FX5500. Doom 3 isn't an easy to run game on cards from the time. Disabling shadows majorly improves frame rates on both the cards, but I've left the presets alone for the sake of these tests. Using the low preset 64x480, the R9550 was able to achieve 41.4 FPS. The FX5500 only 28.8 FPS. Similar case at the medium preset, the R9550 pushed out 28.6 FPS and the FX5500 20.3. Both cards struggled, but the R9550 was able to keep just below 30 FPS at medium settings, while the FX5500 barely kept to 20. Though here's a fun fact: the first time you run a Doom 3 TAM demo it'll be stuttery slow mess, which is why you should run it twice. The second time round is much quicker and reflects actual gameplay performance, from my experience at least. Fear was a game that was ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, including requiring a lot of graphical horsepower at anything but the lowest of settings. I've used the game's default presets, with the only alteration being the resolution. At minimum settings, both cards gave us playable frame rates, the R9550 at 81 FPS and the FX5500 at 66. Low settings, things change. The R9550 dropped all the way down to 31 FPS, all was still playable, but the FX5500 dragged along at 5 FPS. Medium settings, the R9550 was unplayable 11 FPS and the FX5500 at 2 FPS. Far Cry is up next. To benchmark the game I used Hardware OC's benchmarking tool, which allows me to benchmark the same demo at different settings easily. All the settings used were at the same resolution of 1024x768 and were run twice. Minimum settings gave us 71 FPS from the R9550 and 49 from the FX5500. At max settings, the R9550 stayed playable at 27 FPS, the FX5500 not so much at 11 FPS. And at Ultra the score only changed by 1 FPS for the Radeon, and the FX stayed the same, so that's kind of interesting at least. Now, for the final game benchmark I wanted to try something a little newer. Most of the games I thought about initially wouldn't run on both cards, for example Crysis, until I remember that Stalker Call of Pripyat has a benchmarking utility. This game can look much nicer when running on newer GPUs, taking advantage of newer technologies. but also has the ability to run on cards as old as these, which is something I always appreciate a developer caring about. Now there's a lot of data to take in here, so I'll just be focusing on the day section of the benchmark run. At minimum settings, the R9 550 kept a fully 4.15 FPS, and the FX5500 at 18.49 FPS. Medium settings saw playable frame rates again from the Radeon at 31.34 FPS, the FX5500 at 14.08 FPS. Now we skipped high and went all the way to extreme, as it didn't seem to be much of a difference in figures for either card. At extreme, like usual, the Radeon 9550 stayed smooth at 26.64 FPS, the FX5500 at 12.31 FPS. I'm actually a little disappointed at the FX card here. I didn't expect it to do so well, but at the same time my FX5700 managed to achieve much higher frame rates in Shadow of Chernobyl, and they run on practically the same engine. Maybe the difference in performance between the FX series cards is larger than I thought. I'm not even going to bother and try and benchmark this. It's pretty obvious from the visuals alone how far apart the cards are in games like UT3. On the left the Radeon 9550 and the right is the FX5500. Now, do you remember the earlier part about overclocking? Well, yeah, this is the cool thing about that. See, UT3 is almost playable on the Radeon 9550 at stock speeds, but at 466 MHz, that's no small improvement. That's pretty major, I'd say. Again, in a game we can't run on the FX5500 Crisis, the improvement from overclocking is a pretty major one. From 17.25 FPS all the way to 27.58 FPS, from slugfest to enjoyably playable. So what did we learn today? The Radeon 9550 is miles ahead of the Geforce FX5500 in every aspect, especially with more mature drivers. The Radeon is for sure a better card to get if you need a cheap AGP card for an older XP era system. Shockingly similar to how it was at launch, the Radeon actually costs less than the FX5500 on eBay today. Though both cards are cheap and more than in supply. I do want to point out that the FX5500 isn't completely worthless. For games slightly older than it, the card will do more than a good enough job, and in newer but less intensive titles, it offers a decent amount of performance. At the right price, if you just want something fast for say a penny up for an Athlon system, this card will do just fine. Now I don't have time to do this today, but I do want to give this a try in the future, but I'm almost certain Nvidia's drivers from 2004 were simply better than ATI's, which would explain why reviewers got very similar results from each card. Sometimes having the FX beat the Radeon, even with the 64-bit budget variants. It's either that or, well, Nvidia paid a ton of money to reviewers to say nice things about their lackluster product to keep up the reputation and market share, but that'd be crazy and would never happen. Reviewers would never take bribes to give positive reviews. That would just be unethical. Oh, that never happens.
It has been a massacre.